We're going to be, and we are also going to be recording this meeting to make sure that everybody can get this information because it's really important. But I started with that song because we're going to be talking a lot about the budget and what the city wants to fund and what the city is prioritizing. And that was made 8 years ago, and we're still trying to fight for that rec. And even though we've made some progress, there's still so many things that we've asked for as a community that we haven't gotten. So that's why we're here today to talk about the things that need to be funded, like rec centers and also affordable housing. So welcome, welcome. My name is Andrea. I'm from Empower DC. I'm a community organizer. And I think before we get started, I just want to do some quick intros. So I'm going to ask Empower DC staff to come off mute, share your name and your position, and then I can pass it over to our guest speakers. We got some awesome guest speakers today, so they can introduce themselves, and then I'll run through the agenda. Oh, I forgot the most important part. And I would also love for you all to introduce yourselves. And it seems like we got quite a few folks here. So if we could just put our name, ward or neighborhood that you're calling from, and what brought you here today. What are you curious about learning? What are you most concerned about as far as affordable housing and DC budget? So Farrah, you want to come off mute?
Hey everybody, my name's Farrah. I work with Andrea on the housing campaign here at Empower DC. And I'll pass it to Billy to introduce himself.
Hey everyone, Billy Cerullo. I'm an organizer with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I live in Ward 3. I lived in Ward 5 for like 10 years and just couldn't afford to live there anymore. And funny enough, people sleep on Ward 3. There's a lot of rent-controlled apartments. So Glover Park would highly recommend looking at some places over there. And I'm sorry, I think I missed what brought you here tonight. I'm here to talk about federal updates, which are going to be a bummer. I'll go ahead and say that. So just forewarning you, but we got some cool stuff going on. And I'll pass it to Vivian.
Actually, let's just pass it to Mychal, and we're gonna have other folks do it in the chat because we're a few too many tonight, which is great.
Hey y'all. Thanks for playing that bop. I was over here like, okay, that goes. But hey y'all, I'm Mychal Cohen. I am a senior policy analyst at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and I am here to talk about the DC budget, which, spoiler alert, may also be a little bit of a bummer.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for being here tonight. We so look forward to your knowledge and your expertise on all this. We got a lot to process, y'all, so I'm not going to delay no longer, but please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. I see we got Miss Shea Queen already representing Ward 3. We were just talking about it. So, and I look forward to hearing who else is in the room tonight. Lots of Ward 3 here, so that's great. All right, let me share my screen one more time. Okay. So just a quick run of show. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about Empower DC, what guides our work, just to ground this conversation. And then I also want to go into a slight bit of issue framing. I'm not going to take too much time because Mychal and Billy are going to dive into this even more. But just to remind, just set it up why we're here today and why this conversation is so important right now. Then I'll pass it off to Mychal and Billy to give us those local and federal updates. Then we'll talk a little bit about Empower DC's priorities. We want some feedback from y'all as well, what you think we should be thinking about. We'll talk about some ways to take action, and then we'll open it up for questions. Sound good, folks? All right.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all again for being here. So just quickly about Empower DC, and I do see a lot of familiar faces, so that's wonderful, but we always got to ground ourselves in the mission and the vision that guides this work. So Empower DC is a community organization. We were founded in 2003 by our current executive director, Parisa Norozi, and another wonderful longtime activist, Miss Linda Leaks. Our vision is DC is a state. Keyword state, where human rights and needs are met, systemic harm is exposed and repaired, and empowered residents shape the decisions that impact their lives. Our mission is to build the power of DC residents through resident-led community organizing to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice. And encapsulated within all of that is housing justice, which of course brings us a lot of us here today. So our organizational values include honoring the expertise and the history and vision of low and moderate income Black and Brown residents, building collective power that demands accountability from decision makers, disrupting inequitable and unjust systems and institutions, and persisting in the determined, uncompromising pursuit of justice. We are in it for the long haul. We know this work can take decades. We already saw that video was 8 years old, so it takes a long time, and we are in it. As far as our anti-displacement work, our housing justice work, we're doing a lot of things. So we are engaged in eviction prevention outreach. We're doing door-to-door canvassing to make sure that folks that are facing eviction know their rights and have resources to fight the eviction. We also engage in affordable housing preservation. So we're organizing tenants in affordable housing buildings to make sure that there are quality conditions. We're making sure that we're holding slum landlords accountable. And then we also have our anti-displacement network space, which is the space right here. And this is a space for organizers and advocates and residents to collectively come together and process and respond to issues around affordable housing and displacement. And I'm going to add to this list something new that we have going on, which is our tenant power space. And this is a space for tenants themselves to not only get trained on how they can protect themselves from eviction and poor housing conditions, but also be able to organize around broader policies that we need to improve access to quality, affordable housing overall. And we had our wonderful first meeting yesterday at the Anacostia Neighborhood Library. I encourage you, if you're interested in participating, to visit our website, and you can contact me, and I can get you hooked up with our tenant power work. So, this is just our icebreaker. We're already talking about that. But I will just set it up with a brief just why we're here and why this conversation is so important right now. We know that the budget, we've been waiting and waiting for the mayor to release her budget, and I'll let Mychal go into that and why we've been waiting and stuff. But I do just want to point out a couple of things that are really significant about this year. So as you can see, I got a couple of charts here. And if you look here on the left, this is a chart that was made, that was published by our partners at United Planning Organizations. Evictions are at a 10-year high in DC right now, okay? That is just crazy. That is just not okay. Like, we are seeing high levels of displacement. And one of the key factors, one of the key reasons for evictions is this non-payment of rent. We see that 87% of the evictions that occurred in this first quarter were due to non-payment of rent. So there's clearly a tie between these high housing costs and evictions going up and up. And at the same time, if you look here at the right, we're seeing lots of cuts. Now, this is the budget report card. This is just a budget report card that was created by Fair Budget Coalition last year. And it just shows how many things that were not funded at the levels that we needed. For example, emergency rental assistance, ERAP, it was cut by 60% and was not funded at that $100 million that we need. It was only like 25% of the need. And that's super low. That is something that we definitely need to take action on, because again, we are seeing higher and higher amounts of evictions. And and I won't take up too much time because we're going to get into this a little bit later, but I do just want to point out that there has been so many landlord narratives that have blamed tenants and put the fault of, the problems that we're seeing with providing affordable housing on tenants. So, we're seeing these high numbers. We're seeing landlord efforts to speed up eviction processes and to deprioritize funding for things that keep tenants in their homes. So I just want to sound that alarm. That's why we're here today. We want to learn what's going on the local level. And we also want to talk about the federal level, because there's a lot of threats to DC autonomy right now. There's a lot of threats to housing overall in the entire country that are definitely going to have an impact on housing in the district. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to call this meeting today. And with that being said, I am going to pass it off to Mychal so that they can get into the DC budget. Let me just reshare my screen 1 second. Or unless, Mychal, do you want to share your own?
No, if you can.
I got you.
Yeah, that'd be so great. Hey y'all. So like Andrea mentioned, I'm going to be walking through the DC budget, kind of the basics. What is it? How's it structured? Who are the key players? How you can get involved, and then a little bit of getting into, as Andrea sort of hinted at, we are in the wackiest timeline when it comes to the DC budget. And so I'll talk through what the timeline normally looks like and then talk through what it currently looks like. So the DC budget, it is DC, like every other state, and unlike the federal government, has to balance its annual budget. So essentially what that means is all the revenue that we take in, things like taxes, fees, federal funds, have to match DC's expenditures. So those are the things that make the city run, like vouchers or public school funding or affordable housing funding. And so the budget itself essentially has two pieces to it. The first is the operating budget. So the operating budget is, just like it sounds, it's kind of the day-to-day operations of the city. It's where we fund our salaries, our expenses. It's how we fund our programs. And then there's also the capital budget. And the capital budget is kind of like a longer term fund for things like large scale infrastructure projects or IT for government systems. Most of the sort of organizing you see will be thinking about the operating budget. But crucially for Empower, there's some things like public housing improvements, shelter projects that do actually live in that capital budget. And so we go through this long process. We're going to be organizing, showing up at council members' doorsteps. And then at the end of all that, we will have essentially three laws. So the first is the Local Budget Act. And so that kind of allocates different funds to each agency within the government. There'll be the Budget Support Act, and that essentially are any legislative changes needed to enact the Local Budget Act. Generally, we haven't seen big legislation, or sort of frowned upon to have big legislation happen through the Budget Support Act, but crucially for housing, we've seen Mayor Bowser discuss pushing the Rental Act, which I'll talk a little bit later, the sort of devastating piece of legislation. She's talked about pushing that through the Budget Support Act. And we don't like that because it gives the people less time to actually focus on that piece of legislation.
You want the camera?
No.
Oh, I can't yank it.
And then the last thing is the Federal Portion Budget Request Act, and that sort of allocates funds for specific city functions. So moving on. So that's the sort of structure of the budget. Now I'll talk a little bit about who are the key players, who influences the budget. So the first group is us, everyone on this call, all your neighbors. So we have people power, we have loud voices, not myself, some other folks do, and we have love for the city on our side. We have the mayor, Mayor Bowser. I'm sure you all have many feelings about our mayor, but the mayor sort of develops the draft budget, is generally very difficult to influence for folks who don't have money or influence. And then there is the council. So the city council is where a lot of our advocacy will live. So they take the mayor's budget, they will mark it up in their committees, and then they bring the whole thing to a vote. And then the final key actor is Congress. Boo. And so those folks are also pretty difficult to influence. as we don't have representation, but they have to essentially sign off on any DC legislation. So moving forward, thinking about those set of key players, I'll talk a little bit about what does it look like to influence the budget process? Like, how do we, get our foot in the door? So as I said, the mayor is pretty difficult to influence. The key sort of lever point for us will be working with the council. So there's sort of, I think, three big ways that folks can influence the council as they're working on the budget. So the first being budget oversight hearings. So those are each committee within the council. So there's a committee on housing, there's a committee on transportation and the environment, there's a committee on public safety. So each of those committees is going to have a budget oversight hearing. And that is where individuals or organizations can sign up to testify in person or through written testimony about any particular agency. And a little bit later, I'll talk about some of the key budget oversight hearings that are coming up. The other way is, and I think this is really, really key because folks don't always know this, individuals or organizations can just schedule meetings with council members or their staff to just tell them what are your priorities, what do you care about. And the final thing is a lot of organizations, I think Empower will be talking about walkarounds they're doing, but essentially groups will come together, get a lot of folks and walk around talking to each council member about their sort of budget priorities. And so all those are ways that we, through our time and energy, can influence the sort of local budget process. And the last two, I'll sort of go through really quickly. The chief financial officer puts out the revenue forecasts. The budget kind of goes to that office first. It's not really generally a big area of influence. And then again, as I mentioned, there's congressional review. Generally pretty hard to influence them, but you've seen folks like the Free DC folks, through constant pressure, sometimes be able to sort of influence and push Congress. Okay, moving forward. Cool. So this sort of lovely timeline is hypothetically in a functioning government, what the budget timeline would look like. So I'll walk through it and then I'll walk through what it currently looks like. So normally in late last year, and this did happen, agencies will create their budget plans and the mayor begins sort of developing her budget. In early 2025, earlier this year, each of those committees that I mentioned before hosted a performance oversight hearing. So essentially, folks came in and asked about the performance of different agencies from last year. It's a way to get more information about what actually happened with last year's budget. And then normally, at the end of March, the mayor would finalize her budget proposal. April, we would have had council budget hearings. And then in May, this month, the council would be marking up the budget and have taken the first vote on the Local Budget Act and the Budget Support Act. And then finally, they take a second vote because all legislation in DC has a first and a second vote, and then it would transmit to the mayor to be signed. So if we go forward, this is the bizarro version. That's not a typical year. So we still currently don't know what's in the budget. So we hope, it seems pretty likely this time that the budget will come out on the 27th. So that's next week. The council budget hearings, which are still sort of being added to the hearing system that the council uses, but they'll be scheduled over the end of this month and into June. On June 18th, given that timeline, we'd expect the final sort of full hearing on the budget. On the 23rd through the 25th, we'd expect the council and committee to be marking up the budget and have the first that first budget vote. And then July 14th, we'd expect that first vote to happen. And then by the 28th, we'd expect the second vote on the Local Budget Act. So the timeline has been pushed back a great deal. And as I said, we still don't fully know what's in the budget. We've heard the mayor has come out and said some of the nice things that she's doing in the budget, like fully funding some early education programs and putting $100 million into the Housing Production Trust Fund. But we suspect that is to deflect from some of the deep cuts that we expect to be in this year's budget. And so I see in the chat someone has perfectly laid me up for the next slide, which is, why isn't this a typical year? What happened? So what happened is that the current budget, which is the budget we passed last year, there is about $1 billion that Congress, from what we hear, was an administrative error. Essentially $1 billion from DC's budget is being held up. And so that's local funds. It's not federal money. It's DC money from DC taxes. We are unable to spend because of how Congress passed their own sort of continuing resolution for the federal budget. And so the Senate has passed legislation that would allow us to spend our full budget, but that legislation is being held up currently in the House. Folks are currently organizing. No one seems to be against passing it, and yet it still hasn't happened. And because of that $1 billion gap, which would mean that DC would sort of immediately have to cut a lot of services. DC has already started doing things like hiring freezes, cutting some of its services that it offers. And that sort of change to this past budget has held up the publishing of the upcoming budget. So essentially, the mayor has said that the chief financial officer is requiring them to have fully fleshed out all the cuts from this past budget of that $1 billion in order to certify the mayor's upcoming budget. So if we go to the next slide. And so that has led to this delay where the mayor has been saying, we've already developed the budget, but we can't release it yet. Council passed legislation to try to force her to release the budget. And now we finally, it seems, will be actually receiving the budget for the upcoming year on the 27th. And so critically, in addition, kind of separately from that $1 billion being held up from last year's budget, we expect there to be about $1 billion budgetary gap from earlier estimates, largely because of all the federal layoffs. And so what we expect is a number of really significant cuts to various programs. If we use, what we've seen from this mayor in the past, a lot of the programs that impact residents who are struggling the most are likely to get cut. And so that will behoove a lot of us to really make a lot of noise to sort of protect the programs that are meaningful to us and push legislators to raise revenue, to actually bring more funds coming in to make up for some of that budgetary gap. And then if we kick forward, yep. So I've pulled out here some of the key budget oversight hearings coming up that I think would be most relevant to this group related to affordable housing. So on Thursday, May 29th, as you can see, this budget process is going to move really quickly. We don't even have the budget yet, and there will be a budget oversight hearing 2 days after the release of the budget. So that is where we'll hear from the Office of Planning and the Department of Buildings. So the Department of Buildings is relevant because they're the folks who, handle issues with your apartment or issues with, your landlord not repairing things. There's a budget oversight hearing on Friday, May 30th. That's the DC Housing Authority. As many of you all know, the DC Housing Authority are the folks who oversee the voucher system. They oversee public housing. That's going to be incredibly important. Budget oversight hearing for housing. And another one that I'll highlight is on Monday, June 9th. There's a committee on housing budget oversight hearing that will be the Department of Housing and Community Development and the Housing Production Trust Fund. So that's how we fund a lot of our affordable housing. And I also know you all work a lot on environmental issues. So on Friday, June 13th, there'll be a committee on transportation and environment budget oversight hearing. Featuring the Department of Energy and the Environment. Okay, so
Question, Mychal, if I'm not seeing those on the calendar,
some of
is
them
it-
haven't been
Thank you.
added yet.
Okay, you have
Yeah.
some insider info on the dates.
Yeah, they
Okay, great.
released the sort of there's a schedule out there. They just haven't added some to the calendar for whatever reason, I guess because everything's just happening too quickly.
Okay, great.
Okay, so that is the sort of budgetary process as a whole. As I said, it'll be moving really quickly, being present for some of those budget oversight hearings, holding the council accountable to their decision making is going to be incredibly important because there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to move quickly and push through the budget quickly because of this shortened timeline. And then if that were not enough things for you to keep track of, we also have a really important hearing from the Committee on Housing coming up on the 28th. So if you're keeping track, that's the day after the release of the budget. And typically during budget season, you aren't seeing big pieces of legislation come through because everyone's focused on the budget. But the mayor has sort of pushed through this hearing on a few different pieces of housing legislation. And it'll be really important for folks to show up to that hearing. So the 28th will be a hearing on the Rental Act, the Fair Housing Practices Amendment Act, Eviction Reform Amendment Act, and then the Common Sense TOPA Reform Act. So what does that all mean? So the Rental Act is the mayor's bill that she is claiming is a reform of the affordable housing system to respond to some of the current struggles of affordable housing developers. In practice, it doesn't really offer any additional funding for affordable housing. It doesn't offer any support for residents to afford their housing. What it does do is it eliminates TOPA rights for a large number of renters. And again, TOPA is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, essentially a right for all DC residents that if your building that you live in is going up for sale, you have the opportunity, you have a seat at the table. You can either collectively purchase the building, but what more likely happens is you can assign the rights to a friendly developer, sort of help preserve or create affordability in your building. And so what the mayor's bill does is basically eliminates that right for everyone who is in a building, in a new building and it also eliminates it for most folks who are in affordable housing. So essentially, if you live in a building that gets subsidy funds, to make it affordable, you would no longer have access to your TOPA rights. The bill also reduces and in some cases eliminates the sort of notice time that landlords need to give tenants before evicting them. And it also speeds up the eviction process. So if you if your landlord does bring you to eviction court, this bill would call for the process to go even quicker than it already does, give folks less time to defend themselves. So this bill is really, really bad. And so it's really important for folks to show up to that hearing or submit testimony and let folks know that we don't support taking rights from our neighbors and sort of faster, quicker evictions, because as Andrea sort of pointed to, evictions are already at a 10-year high. And then the last thing, if you weren't already tired of hearing my voice, the last thing that I'll talk about is I've just said all this about the sort of $1 billion and our on last year's budget being withheld, $1 billion gap for this upcoming budget. And in the midst of all this happening, in the midst of the mayor likely asking us to take a lot of cuts to the programs that keep ourselves and our neighbors safe and housed and fed, we see the mayor also giving a huge giveaway when it comes to RFK Stadium. So if you all haven't seen the proposed deal, the mayor is proposing essentially $1 billion in sort of direct subsidy for as it relates to RFK Stadium, and then analysis of the sort of deal as a whole. Estimates kind of range from different amounts, but a pretty consistent expectation is that over the full life of the deal, it'll be about a $6 billion giveaway of district residents' money in terms of direct taxes, waiving taxes for as it relates to the stadium, and then also essentially a $1 lease of the land to the commanders over the life of this deal. So as you see, this is a huge, massive amount of funding that we are expecting to put into the stadium at the same time as we're sort of seeing and expecting all of these potential really big cuts to necessary programs. So yeah, so with that, I'll sort of close out and sort of pass it off to hear a little bit more about the sort of federal landscape.
And thank you, Mychal. That was a really great recap of what's happening here. Oh my goodness. I see a couple hands raised. So I do just want to pause for like 1 minute just to process. I know that was a lot of information. So I just want to give a couple minutes for us to process, ask any questions, and then I'm going to cut it off and we're going to move on to the federal stuff, and then we can open it up again for questions at the end. Okay, so just 1 or 2 comments or questions that folks might have. I see Ms. Shea Queen.
Yes, I don't live in the ward where the stadium is being built, but have you guys talked to any of the residents, and what are their thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's that's a very important question, and that's something we just talked about at our members meeting, actually, Ms. Shea Queen. Yes, there hasn't been as much conversation with residents that there needs to be. So we're actually thinking about putting a group together of residents, including folks that live nearby the stadium, to kind of put pressure on to make sure that our voices are being heard, and that folks are especially folks that are living nearest the stadium, are being heard. And especially when it comes to the affordable housing and the missed opportunities there. We definitely want to uplift that. So yes, thank you for that question. We're in the midst of forming a group, and if you are interested, I can put my information in the chat, and or Farah can do it, and it'll also be in the slides. So you can get in touch with me and I can tell you more about that. Okay. If there isn't any more comments for right now, I'm just going to move on to let Billy go on to talk about the federal things that are happening. So, Billy, I pass it off to you. And I think you have your own slides, right?
Yes, I do. If I can share, that would be great. One question for you, Mychal. How many people are going to be housed with the stadium deal?
It's been, the sort of number has shifted a bit. I've heard 5,000 sort of floated. But it'll be a tiny, tiny fraction of what the amount of folks that could be housed on the land if it were, for instance, used to sort of make a mixed use development.
Right. Yeah, that was a snarky question. I expected the answer to be very few. Sharing my slides, now we get to talk about something really exciting and uplifting, the federal government. Don't get too excited, everybody. Although, although this is a slide deck about updates within the federal government, particularly when we're talking about housing, I also kind of want us to think about this as a local issue too, and I'll try to kind of weave that in throughout the slide deck. Again, my name is Billy Cerullo. I've lived in DC 11, 12 years now, and I'm an organizer with the National Low Income Housing Coalition based in DC. And a lot of what we do is advocacy on the federal level, pushing members of Congress, the president, HUD, Supreme Court, advocating for affordable housing, particularly when we're talking about low income renters. We also focus on issues around homelessness in the unhoused community. But more often than not, we'll rely on our national partners like the National Alliance on Homelessness, for example, National Coalition of the Homeless, and we'll sort of follow their lead and help with their advocacy efforts as well. Our advocacy, our coalition is pretty broad-based. We have developers, we have advocates, we have tenant unions, resident associations, policy wonks, researchers, kind of you name it, a lot of students, both organizational members and then also individual members. And so if you're interested in getting more involved, please shoot me an email. So, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the budget that we are currently in, which Mychal alluded to earlier with that $1.1 billion cut in the middle of our fiscal year. I don't think that it's any secret that Trump and Congress have it out for DC, and have it out for all of us living here. And that shows in their budget. So, in the same continuing resolution that they passed in March, they severely underfunded HUD programs, which ultimately, despite the fact that those are federal programs, obviously impacts the work that we're doing in DC and impacts families currently being served by those programs. So, in that continuing resolution, we estimate a loss of 32,000 housing choice vouchers. Those are often called Section 8 vouchers. And that would be across the country. We're also seeing that public housing authorities are having to adjust their operations and what they're doing in their programs to minimize potential impacts on housing and on households. So we're starting, not even starting because we're in that budget cycle now. And yes, I can put my info in the chat. We are, I'll say starting for lack of a better word, we're starting on bad footing because this FY25 continuing resolution is already slashing HUD programs. But to make matters worse, the president released his skinny budget, which was passed by the House yesterday. And that goes even further. This is also, mind you, the backdrop for all of this is a 50% cut, proposed 50% cut to HUD staff. In addition to that, HUD office is being proposed to close. Now, the date that was slated for that to happen was May 18th. So that came and went. What we've seen is our advocacy on the federal level seems to be working. Despite the fact that HUD staff has shrunk in size, more because folks have taken that buyout, that fork in the road decision, as opposed to mass layoffs. But we still have our eye on those 50% cuts to HUD staff. With regards to HUD programming, the president's skinny budget, and it's called the skinny budget because it's not super detailed. You might even say it's a concept of a plan. It doesn't go into specific detail about sort of, what is cut, how it's going to be cut. It just gives kind of a baseline. That baseline is 43% cuts to HUD rental assistance. And what it's calling for is, as opposed to continuing to fund specific programs like housing choice vouchers, public housing, project-based rental assistance, Section 202, which is for housing for the elderly and for seniors, Section 811, which is housing for individuals living with a disability. It's putting all of that into one block grant program to be given to states and DC. What that means is it's saying, here's a pot of money, figure out how to use it. But by the way, we're going to cut the amount of money we're giving to you and counting on you to make up the costs. It's also imposing a 2-year limit. So it's capping the number of years that individuals and households can receive HUD assistance, particularly for quote unquote able-bodied adults. So it caps assistance at 2 years. It also attacks homeless assistance grants and slashes funding for homelessness assistance by $532 million. And again, consolidating all of these programs into what is proposed to be called the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. Similarly with caps, it's capping homelessness assistance for all individuals at 2 years. How many people here think that 2 years is enough for folks to get the services that they need and then find housing?
No, it's not enough at all.
Right, right. So this is a massive attack on housing programs for families. And I don't even want to say low-income families for a variety of reasons. I'll say just working families, because quite frankly, the data shows that most of these folks are in the workforce, are in the labor force, but they're not getting paid enough. Which sounds familiar if you're a working person in DC. Some of the other programs, yeah, Shay, go ahead.
Yeah, so just a quick question for an individual able-bodied adult who already have a housing choice voucher, like before this legislation will be put in place, would they have a 2-year limit as well?
That is my understanding. With regards to the reconciliation bill that was passed that cut funding for housing choice vouchers, the idea is that it wouldn't, for that at least, for that loss of, I think it was like 32,000, I said, for that, it wouldn't be going into a household saying, give me your voucher, get out. It would be once your voucher is expired, it dies. Whereas normally it would go to the next person on that wait list. The wait list for DC for Section 8 is like, what, 10 plus years? I mean, there are people who've been on it for over a decade. So there's already, I mean, we know there's not enough funding, and this is cutting it even more.
How long are housing choice vouchers? Like, what's the time limit? Like 10, 15 years?
I'm not sure there is one currently, but I'll check and get back to you.
No, there's no time limit for
Right?
current-
That's what I thought.
Yeah. For public housing or for Section 8, there's no time limit. Because, it doesn't get easier, as Billy's saying, right? The DC housing market is just getting harder, like other ones.
Yeah. Some additional things to know about this proposal. And again, it was passed in the House, but it is still a proposal. It has not happened yet. But this would eliminate community development block grant program. It would eliminate the home investment partnerships program, Indian housing block grant, family self-sufficiency. All of these programs would be eliminated. And in lieu of these programs, or the federal government giving funding for these specific programs, it would be in the form of a block grant. So it's just giving money to states and saying, figure it out, use it however you want. Because it's a block grant, states have a lot of flexibility with how they're using that funding. It would also, and this doesn't really necessarily impact DC, but $720 million would be cut from the USDA Rural Development Program as well. So specific impacts to DC. Right now, this data is taken from the Urban Institute. There are over 49,000 people and 34,000 households that are currently being served by HUD funding. So that means that over $15 million from the Community Development Block Grant Program that DC is currently receiving would be gone. Additionally, over $6 million for the home funding program would be gone, and over 307 million housing choice vouchers, or $307 million funding housing choice vouchers would also be gone. And 89,000 or 89 million rather for public housing. So this is what DC is currently receiving. The top two being eliminated. I misspoke earlier. DC is currently receiving $307 million over that for housing choice vouchers. So that would be reduced.
And you said essentially, like, everything would be cut by more than half?
Basically all of HUD programs cumulatively, it would be 43% of HUD programs.
43% would be cut, or we'd have 43%?
Would be cut. And for housing choice vouchers specifically, I think that is also around 43%.
Oh. So I was just thinking we would I think around 11,000 people or families, right, would be cut from, this is household, okay, 34,000 households. So, okay, so 34,000, 7 times, sorry, I'm doing the math right now.
That's okay.
But if we had 60% of people stayed on, that would be just 20,000. Like 15,000 families would lose their housing.
Well, and the thing too to keep in mind is with this block grant, it would be in our case the mayor and I guess the council figuring out like how we're going to use this funding, but it would not be. It's counting on states and localities to make up the difference.
Right.
And they're saying that. I mean, the current administration is saying that that's the goal, that they want states to pay up, which is sort of a bright spot. Because guess which states receive more federal funding, than others, Republican red states. And again, the House passed this budget by a single vote. It was not a slam dunk. And the good news being too that there are concerns in the Senate that have been voiced publicly. Susan Collins, who quite frankly, and I told her office this not long ago, I'm sick of relying on her to just do the right thing and then her like teetering and then doing the opposite of what we want her to do. But, she's coming from Maine, which is a pretty rural state that relies on a lot of these federal housing programs, including LIHEAP. LIHEAP is I always forget what the acronym stands for, but it's essentially utility assistance provided to households to help pay their utility bills. That program has been completely eliminated. The staff has been completely eliminated. There's no one in the LIHEAP office. So that program's just gone. Farah, also very good point. Landlords rely on Section 8 too, especially in states and cities that have source of income discrimination laws on the books. So that's been something that has been promising also, where there are kind of these, I don't want to call them necessarily like unholy alliances, but strange bedfellows, people that do rely on HUD assisted programs that aren't tenants, who aren't tenants, and might have different access than tenant associations and tenant unions have. So, Senator Collins is also important to note because she chairs the Senate Appropriations Committee, and that's the committee that is in charge of figuring out how money is spent. That is the Budget Committee. So both her and the vice chair, Patty Murray, who's a Democrat from Washington, both of them have specifically voiced concerns about this budget as it relates to HUD, as it relates to housing programs. Again, do we want to bank on this? Absolutely not. Yes, lie, heap, low income. Yep, thank you. I always forget what the acronym stands for. Also, lie, heap is just fun to say. So again, the good thing is there are folks in the Senate who have expressed concerns, and where we're at now is all forecasts point to the Senate tearing this bill apart. But again, none of us should rely on that.
And it could pass by a simple majority?
I don't know. I don't think it does. I think it has to have no. I think it has. I don't think it's a
So
simple
too.
majority
Yeah, because it's
the budget. Yeah. So this is more or less the process by which the budget is formed, very similar to DC. So I would say call your member of Congress, but again, you don't have one. None of us do. I don't either. The reason though at the top why I said oh, it's reconciliation because it's reconciliation, that's right. Yeah, so simple. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the chat. Okay. At the top of this, though, the part of the reason why I said that we should think about this locally is amidst all of these cuts that Mychal laid out that the mayor is proposing and putting forth, this is also compounded by all of these proposed cuts from the federal government. And this is lost funding that DC is otherwise relying on to administer these housing programs. So it could also be a good conversation to have with the mayor and the city council about what is the plan to make up for these costs. The reason why I asked the snarky question of how many units is the stadium going to provide is because I quite frankly, I think that shows where the mayor's priorities are. But I also think that she's in a weird spot where it feels like she's kowtowing to Trump a little bit, and playing things very safe. And I think a massive, protest or something that would focus on her and call her out would be something that she probably wouldn't welcome and might be helpful. I don't know. All that to say, you know, I do think it's important for members of Congress to hear from us, and specific ones in particular, like Susan Collins, like Patty Murray. Um, it's worth also mentioning that Susan Collins, the Republican from Maine, was the senator that put the amendment into the Senate version of reconciliation that restored the $1.1 billion cut to DC. So I do think that there is some agency or some utility to call, but I would also make sure that members of the city council and the mayor, if they're not aware of this, they're aware that you all are aware of this. So I also just wanted to take some time to talk about our budget priorities, what we're pushing for. Obviously, full funding to renew all existing housing choice vouchers, and also 60,000, enough funding to renew 60,000 emergency housing vouchers. Also increased funding for public housing operations and capital needs, which is chronically underfunded every year. Um, funding for homeless assistance grants, which are needed now more than ever. $20 million for eviction protection grant, the eviction protection grant program, and also at least $1.3 billion towards HUD's tribal housing programs, and $150 million for competitive funds targeted to tribes with the greatest need. That seems to be something that members of Congress are somewhat amenable to. Let me look at the question in the chat. Blue Rose says that they expect states to make up to do so. Let me check on that. I'm not sure. The question that I've had is can specific states, to give it context, a little bit more context, I have 13 states in my region, DC included, but that also includes South Carolina, West Virginia, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, states that do not by far have the infrastructure to make up those costs. So the question that I've had is even less of do they have to, it's how much can they set aside, because they're already strapped and very, very heavily reliant on federal funding. But I'll check on that and I can get back to you. I mentioned this at the top, but a little bit of information about HUD staff. HUD staff has been reduced 23 to 30%. Again, a lot of that has been the fork in the road. A lot of people have taken the buyout. But folks that are currently working there, who we do continue to work with, particularly the Disaster Housing Recovery Department, they are really spread thin. So a lot of these programs, and this seems to be the strategy that the Trump administration has in DOGE, is gut the staff to where the programs are not able to run because there's no one in the office. But the proposal does still stand to reduce the total agency by 50%, which the secretary, last I checked, has not signed off on. He's weird, to put it mildly. We're still, I think, trying to kind of get a grasp on where he stands in all this. But again, without sufficient staff, I mean, they can't perform basic functions. These programs can't run. So yeah, again, we're very open. We want to meet with the secretary, because he seems to be open to slowing down these cuts. And he seems to understand that you need people in the office to run these programs. Again, a few bright spots. On the federal level, we're working very closely with members of Congress to try to push back in any way that we can. Rallies outside of HUD, rallies at state capitals that we're partnering with our state partners across the country in strategic locations to put pressure on their state and local governments, to leverage them against what's going on in the federal level. Because again, there's a realization that and an understanding that these states cannot make up these costs. So we do feel and see that advocacy is working, that there has been a little bit of a slowdown to cuts to HUD, particularly staff. These proposed cuts to HUD programs, it's not really anything new. Maybe how far they go is new, but the president proposed these in his first administration. And we fought really hard and we staved them off then, and we'll do everything we can to do it again now. But again, would really want to emphasize that, mentioning this to the mayor, mentioning this to the city council and saying, what are you prepared to do to make up these costs? You're proposing this stadium and spending how much money? Well, we know that, X number of dollars from HUD are at risk. And that's funding we're already counting on. So a lot of this doesn't apply necessarily, but what I wanted to include this to let you know what we're doing across the country. Again, we're targeting members of Congress in key states as they're going on recess to try to schedule meetings and make sure that tenants, folks that are impacted directly are in the room, i.e. constituents are in the room and sharing why this is a bad idea, how this is going to impact them directly, but also the service providers and the practitioners being able to share that these cuts are going to decimate programs that are already in existence, and decimate programs that the state relies on. AmeriCorps being one of those programs. There are a lot of pretty red states that rely on AmeriCorps funding because it's cheap labor. But again, I think it's especially important that we're mobilizing in DC and organizing in DC to put pressure on the mayor and the city council, because the mayor's already targeting housing in a way that is harmful. And it would be worse if in the midst of that, we're also facing these steep cuts. So happy, again, I'm sorry to be so depressing, but happy to take questions. And also more than happy to share about what's going on in other parts of the country if there's an interest there.
Yes, I have a question. Have your organization reached out to a lot of housing vouchers tenants? Because I'm one. We had to move out of Park Morton because of redevelopment, and I live in a fairly nice building, but my housing voucher pays half of my rent. So there's a lot of people that I know that have vouchers, and they do not know anything about this movement, or no one have told them what they're up against. So I think that all the people who on housing vouchers need to be alerted ASAP, because there are a lot that do not know about it.
Yep. Yeah, a big part of what we're doing too is exactly what we're doing here, and meeting with tenant associations, tenant unions,
Right.
tenant organizing shops across the country, and making sure that the organizers know, because they already have those relationships, and it's a lot easier for them to be able to go around and say, hey, by the way, this is what's coming down the pike.
That's right.
So the short answer is yes. That's a big part of our strategy as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions, folks, before I'm gonna just talk a little bit about, I'm so glad you said that, Miss Alice, because that's one of the ways that we want to take action as well. So I'm glad we're all on the same page about that. But if there isn't any more immediate questions, I am going to just run through some of the quick action steps that we're considering, and also some of our budget priorities. And then we can open it up for questions and comments again. I'm happy to do that. All right, so just give me 1 second. Let me share my screen. Okay. And thank you again, Billy and Mychal, for all that you shared. That was a really informative conversation. So thank you all so much. So I think a lot of these budget priorities, even though federal level is obviously a little bit different than the local level, I think a lot of the priorities are similar. So we're also interested in fully funding public housing and getting that recurring funding for public housing repairs. We're also interested in funding access to justice, which helps us to do eviction prevention work, and also helps folks that are facing eviction to get access to attorneys. We are also asking for, and this was our ask last year, we're asking for it again, $100 million for emergency rental assistance. This is one of the last stops for preventing evictions and preventing homelessness. So we need to make sure we're funding that. And also we want to have full funding for the Department of Buildings for their proactive inspections and enforcement program. We know that bad housing conditions are another key factor in displacement. And we often know that bad housing conditions and evictions can go hand in hand. I can't tell you how many times I've been out We've all been out doing our outreach, and we've had multiple evictions and also super bad housing conditions, including standing water, mold, pests, things like that. So it's really important that we take a deeper look at the proactive inspections and enforcement program and make sure that we're providing the funding that we need so that it can actually have impactful consequences that encourage landlords to do the repairs. And then also looking into the Department of Energy and Environment's mold remediation program. Mychal mentioned earlier that that is going to be one of the hearings. So that's why DOEE is so important, because that is one of the key ways that we can get mold treated in the city. And I realize those are just a couple of our priorities. I do want to share in the chat really quick our we work with the Fair Budget Coalition. We are a member of the Fair Budget Coalition, and there is a complete platform that includes even more priorities that are important to us. So I am going to quickly share that link in the chat so that you all can review. And I am going to reshare my screen. Give me one moment.
And if you are thinking about testifying on any of the things like that Mychal mentioned earlier, the Rental Act, which is going to be on the 28th, which I think is that Tuesday? Okay, Tuesday. No, Wednesday. Monday's a holiday. So yeah, on Wednesday for the Rental Act or for any of the housing agencies, put it in the chat, put in which one you're thinking about. Andrea and I are happy to follow up with you individually and provide whatever level of support you'd like for getting your testimony ready. And I did want to mention, Andrea might be about to say this, but just while you're putting up your slides, for the Rental Act, Councilmember Robert White did say that he would accept video testimony in advance. So in fact, if you can't be there Wednesday, because I know there are already probably 100 people signed up to testify, you can just do a little selfie video of yourself for a few minutes and submit your testimony to Robert White that way.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Farah. We always be like right here in our thoughts, because that is actually what I was going to talk about next, is how you can testify. So I'm not going to repeat, but I will just, briefly mention that there is that May 28th testimony opportunity. Please sign up, or again, submit that video testimony. You can also submit written testimony, so we can help you through that as well if you aren't able to be there on Wednesday. And I just want to re-emphasize that we heard a lot about a lot of different cuts that are happening, and then a lot of different limitations on tenant protections that are happening all at once. And their hearings are back to back to back. And we know that that takes a lot of capacity and a lot of numbers. So we have to come out together and organize together to really put pressure on council to prioritize residents, to stand with residents, and not further displacement in the city. So if you are a renter, if you are someone who has experienced eviction or at risk of eviction, or if you are someone who has experienced poor housing conditions, or if you are a renter that just wants to protect your housing, because hey, those TOPA limitations, those are going to affect a lot of people. So it really, it takes a city. We all need to be standing up and sharing our stories and testifying, because a lot of these cuts and a lot of these pieces of legislation, they were pushed forward by a lot of advocacy on the part of landlords, saying that rental arrears are just getting worse and worse. People just don't want to pay. We need to do something to limit tenant protections and just speed up the eviction process so that we can, quote unquote, get paying tenants in. So it's really important for us to counter that narrative so that we can really shape the funding in this budget season, and also shape those pieces of legislation that are really anti-renter. So shout out to Farah for coming up with that wonderful term. It's because it's really the Anti-Renter Act. So Mychal mentioned this earlier. There's a bunch of budget related hearings that are coming up. Please sign up to testify. We can help you to do that. My information is in the chat. And then Mychal also mentioned this a little bit earlier. Council walkarounds are super important. It's wonderful to testify, and it's wonderful to share your voice, because we obviously, you get to testify in front of this big audience and we really get our voices heard. But it's also great to do council walkarounds, to do that one-on-one direct conversation with council members so that they know our priorities before and after the hearing. Okay, they need to hear it again and again and again, as many times as possible. We need to be in their face, letting them know we need you to stand with tenants. So we are happy to take a group of folks for a walk around. We've done it before with the emergency rental assistance changes that were happening, way back in November. We did it again for our advocacy in March. Advocacy Day in March, and we're happy to do it again. So if you are interested in doing a council walk around, you can put your name and council walk around in the chat, and we can be sure to follow up with you. And we'll have a little crew that goes to all the council members, especially Robert White and Matthew Fruman. Those are really important council members because Robert White, of course, is the head of the Housing Committee, and then Matt Fruman, of course, is the head of the Human Services Committee, which, of course, includes DHS, which runs ERAP. So those are really important opportunities to get in the room directly with decision makers.
Isn't Matt Furman also the Ward 3 council person as well? Okay, all right.
I'm so glad you brought that up too, because there's a lot of Ward 3 folks in here. So please call your council member. Let's actually visit the council member as well. And I also just want to, mention that it is also important to keep an eye on that federal stuff that is happening, and make sure that you're calling the senators, people like Collins, to just remind them to prioritize tenants. So folks might already have an idea of this already, but I just want to share a couple of key things that we definitely want to make sure we emphasize in our testimony, key questions to consider when you're writing. So just make sure, especially if you are a directly impacted resident, we definitely need to hear your voice, really sharing how displacement has impacted you, your experience using the different programs that we want to fight to protect, like emergency rental assistance. Making sure that council knows what's working and what's not working, and also what our key asks are around that, how much money we actually need to make sure that folks can stay in their homes, that $100 million. And then just also making sure that you emphasize how this funding would help, what are the benefits of doing that? Like I said, council really wants to hear about that direct experience. So if you are a tenant that has that direct experience, please, please, please share your story. And we do have this is just another testimony structure example, but we do have other opportunities for folks to share their story. So we have our oral history project arm with Corey, who is a wonderful, wonderful oral historian. He's working on our DC Legacy project, and we are really trying to capture tenant stories as far as not only the impacts of all these things, but also the organizing and the leadership. So beyond just testifying at council hearings, beyond just going to the council walkarounds, we want to capture these stories continuously so that we can use them in various forms of advocacy, not just during the budget season, but all the time, because we know that this doesn't just end with budget season. There's so much more. And so many reasons to keep advocating to stop displacement in DC. So with that being said, I definitely want to open it up for questions and comments. I know that was lickety split. That was a lot of information. And I know we got some questions answered already, but if folks have other questions, if folks have other priorities that I didn't mention that you want to bring up, please bring them up. I definitely want to hear from you, or we all want to hear from you.
I guess as far as the stadium, is parking also included? There will be restaurants as well. I'm guessing a hotel maybe as well.
Yeah, there's
I heard
definitely
about the parking.
a good amount of parking. I think one thing, I heard, I was just looking at Andrea's information that a lot of people support the Commander Stadium. This kind of metaphor that I heard is like a stadium is kind of like a party. Like when you have that party, a lot of people come and it's really fun and you have a great time. but you don't have a party to make money. You don't have a party to make jobs. You know, even if you do have a fancy party and have a caterer, that job's only for a few hours, right? And that's kind of how a stadium is. Like, it's fun when you're at the game, or if you get to see Beyonce, you know, that sounds great. But a lot of the time it's just empty. And so the jobs can be unstable. There's just empty parking lots, big swaths of land. As Mychal said, you know, if we could control, you know, if DC wasn't giving up that land and could control that land, we could do a lot more housing than having, you know, a big stadium and empty parking lots.
Right.
But yeah, it does include a bunch of things. It's kind of, you know, a playground for people who want to come visit.
So maybe job opportunities for DC residents, maybe.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think whatever, you know, they have there, there'd be some jobs, right? It's a lot of land. But I think, you know, sometimes when we just say like, would you like a stadium? It's like, well, sure. But if you don't have to think about what are the trade-offs, you know, and that's not, yeah. And then Mychal just said, folks aren't clocking how much money we're giving away. Because not only, as Mychal mentioned this earlier, like not only is it, you know, that the stadium is $1 a year for a rental, which is, yep, less rent than, you know, I'm sure all of you all pay, $1 a year. But it's also giving them full control of the land. And we know that land is where the money's at in DC, right? So instead of the city creating, you know, what we would like to see there, which might be housing and restaurants and small businesses and, you know, whatever else, it's the commanders, a billionaire, by the way. Ted Leonis, you know, creating what he wants to see and what will bring him money. Because, you know, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that billionaires are looking out for us, right? But so the city, though, could actually be using all of that land. Yeah, housing for $1, right?
Yes.
If we're renting things for $1 now. That's
I
right,
have
Miss
a
Shea Queen.
question. So the money is not gonna be going towards DC residents. It's gonna be going more so to the owner of the commanders. Is that what it's like?
Yeah,
Or
yep,
Right.
yep. And a
Mm.
lot of the money that would be paid out would be paying for like the construction of the stadium, of the parking lots, and in fact, future tax revenue, rather than going to the city, would actually go to the commanders for the upkeep of the stadium. And there's money going out for, you know, also there's a lot of the things that we've seen don't show all of the money. Like, for example, can the metro handle the big increases for big events? Parking money, Mychal was saying also, yep, will also go to the commanders. And yeah, we do it, you know, certainly there would be some jobs. You know, there's a concern that stadium jobs it's not a very even job, right?
Right.
But, you know, I don't know, like, you know, I think for a minute when we think about it, it can be, you know, especially if you like football, like that's, you know, that would be fun.
Or is it like at
But can we think about other jobs too?
is that at the expense of the DC taxpayers?
Oh yeah, it's all taxpayer funded.
Okay.
Yeah, and we should have a longer conversation about this sometime, so I'm gonna stop. But I will say there's not really evidence that stadiums are money makers for cities. There's been a lot of studies of this, and despite the mayor saying it's going to do this and that, the city commissioned a study that showed that it wouldn't make any money. But yeah, let's have another conversation about this because, and I'd love to hear from all of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I just literally wanted to say, like, this literally feels like Deal or No Deal. Like, I don't know if y'all remember that show, but I'm just like, it's not adding up, y'all. Like, anyway, sorry, Shea Queen, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that the Commanders only had one good season, so let's not get too excited. Let's get excited, but let's not get too excited.
Yeah. So what are the trade-offs? Literally, what are the trade-offs? I'm all about having a block party. I like to have fun just as much as the next person, but it's like, you know, we have all these threats right now and we don't have enough affordable housing right now. So we have bigger fish to fry. So that's what we need to be working on. Yeah, exactly. The math ain't mathin', right, Farah? So I just want to thank you all again for such a rich conversation. I feel like every time we have these meetings, I can sit back and just let the conversation flow because everyone brings their knowledge and expertise and experiences. So I appreciate y'all. And I please sign up to testify at least at one of the hearings, at all of the hearings if you can, but I know that's a lot of work, but that's why we work in numbers. So thank you all again for showing up tonight. And if you have any further questions, we will make sure to share everybody's information, Mychal's information, Billy's information, and my information, Farrah's information, so that we can all be able to stay in touch. And thank you again to my guest speakers, and thank you, Farrah.